All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the fourth webinar in our EPIC series on the use of NAMs and risk assessment. This series is being co-organized by the Environmental Protection Agency, PETA Science Consortium International, the Institute for In Vitro Sciences, and the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. I'm Rachel Bruner, a biologist with the US EPA, and I'll be co-moderating today's webinar along with several others, including Gino Scarano, a senior advisor from the New Chemicals Division of the EPA Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, Niladri Baumick, a toxicologist in the Human Health Assessment Branch of the California DPR, Amy Clippinger, president of the PETA Science Consortium International, and Christy Sullivan, the Vice President of Education and Outreach at IIVS. Before I introduce our speakers, note that the slides and a recording from today's webinar will be posted online at this link shortly after the webinar. All future EPIC webinar materials will also be available at this link as the series continues. Also, before I begin, I just want to let you know that our next webinar has been scheduled for August 28th. So tune in then to hear from Michael Lowett and Kamal Mansouri about addressing acute toxicity information needs with the CAPMOS computational model. Register on the PSCI or PETA Science Consortium International website. All right, so with that, we have two speakers today who will be presenting on progress at the US EPA for advancing eye irritation assessment with non-animal methods for industrial chemicals and agrochemicals. First, we'll hear from Lindsay Adele from EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, and second from Renee Beardslee from the EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. We will do a Q&A session at the end of the second presentation. The webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours. We may wrap up earlier, sort of depending on how long the questions go. Everyone is muted, but you can type any questions into the questions module within your Zoom toolbar. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. And we just ask that you please indicate if your question is directed to a specific speaker. And please don't add any questions to the chat. We have also enabled closed captions. You can go ahead and turn this feature on and off according to your preference using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, Gino Scarano would like to share some introductory comments from the EPA. Gino?
Thanks, Rachel. First of all, I want to thank all of you for joining today, but I especially want to thank our two speakers, Lindsay and Renee, for taking time out of a very busy schedule here, as they're both EPA employees, to prepare for and give today's webinar. And as always, I want to thank our co-organizers, especially PETA and IVS, because they handle all the logistics. So all we at EPA have to do is show up. So very happy about that. And thanks for all that continued logistical support. And that's it for my introductory remarks. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Gino. Next, our colleague from the California DPR, Niladri Baumick, will make some comments.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Rachel. And hello and greetings to everyone from here in Sacramento, California. On behalf of everyone here at California Department of Pesticide Regulation, I extend my sincere thanks to all of you who are joining today, and also cordially welcome you all to this fourth edition of the EPIC webinar on NAMs. We at DPR are especially excited to be part of this webinar series, along with our colleagues of EPA, IIVS, and PETA Science Consortium. I extend my warm welcome to our esteemed speakers today, and looking forward to great presentations, especially on building confidence and broadening the use of non-animal approaches to determine all possible eye irritation hazards. With those words, I return it back to Rachel.
Thank you, Niladri. So speaking first today will be Lindsay Odell. Lindsay Odell earned her bachelor's in biology and chemistry from Spring Arbor University in Michigan, her home state. Prior to joining EPA, she worked in the energy industry as a water quality specialist and as a secondary science teacher both domestically and internationally. Upon joining EPA in 2016, she has worked as a biologist and acting team leader in the antimicrobials division, reviewing product chemistry and acute toxicity data for a variety of pesticide formulations and active ingredients. She was awarded the OCSPP Bronze Medal Award as a member of the COVID-19 Science Response Team and has served in the coordinator role for the Office of Pesticide Program's Tox 21 work group, working closely with the office's senior leaders to support implementation of new approach methodologies for the past several years. So welcome, Lindsay, and I can see your slides, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the introduction. Glad that the screen share is working properly, and hopefully you can all hear me well also. Good morning again, everyone. Also wanted to echo Gino's comments on a big thanks to the entire team of folks behind the coordination of the EPIC webinar series. It's my pleasure to be here with you today to discuss the advancements made in assessing eye irritation for agrochemical pesticides within the Office of Pesticide Programs. Before I begin my presentation today, I need to provide the standard disclaimer that this presentation reflects my views and not necessarily the policies of the APA, and any mention of specific names or products does not constitute an endorsement from EPA. To give you a brief overview of what I'll discuss today, I'm going to touch on some of the new approach method milestones that have led us up to today, summarize some of the important work in the eye irritation space specifically. Then I'll expand upon the most recent publication presenting two defined approaches specifically for agrochemical formulations. And lastly, I'll present some of the OCSPP metrics on NAMs and outline some next steps for implementation of classification for eye irritation for agrochemical formulations. So for a bit of background, I wanted to highlight some of the previous progress EPA and our collaborators have achieved. Now, this background and milestones, they're not all inclusive of all of the progress that has been made over many years, but I did want to start out in 2015. This year marks the update to the alternative testing framework for assessing eye irritation, specifically for antimicrobial cleaning products, as the antimicrobials division has been using this policy for almost 10 years now to classify products across all four EPA toxicity categories. Around that same time, in 2016, the former director of OPP, Jack Hausinger, sent a letter to stakeholders to emphasize OPP's commitment to reduce the use of animal testing to fulfill the acute toxicity data requirements, which we commonly refer to as the six-pack. And this commitment would only be achieved in the letter he mentioned by working collaboratively with all stakeholders. Moving forward in time, many of you on this call will be familiar with the agency-wide New Approach Methods Work Plan, which was updated in 2021. And the work plan provides a roadmap for achieving a reduction in the use of vertebrate animals for toxicity testing, as well as for research purposes. Also in 2021, the National Toxicology Program Interagency Center for the Evaluation of Alternative Toxicological Methods, also known as NICETM, published a study on the eye irritation potential of 16 agrochemical formulations, which were tested using up to 8 different in vitro methods. And that study evaluated the concordance across all the in vitro approaches and also compared those concordance to the traditional in vivo test in rabbits. So I wanted to highlight a notable theme across these milestones, and that is the importance of conducting confidence building activities. These activities are a very important component to implementation of alternative methods for regulatory purposes. Activities that enhance scientific confidence are directly linked to participation from stakeholders, the willingness to share data, and of course, support and collaboration from other governmental and non-governmental organizations. Along the same lines of confidence building, it's also critical to evaluate the human relevance of new approach methods used to assess eye irritation. Therefore, this slide highlights a recent publication from 2021 by Dr. Amy Klippinger and others that reviewed 15 alternative assays, as well as the in vivo rabbit test for human relevance. Several of the test methods included in this review publication are accepted OECD test guidelines, but not necessarily all of them. The paper made a comparison of the various tissue models used to assess eye irritation in vivo. The review described the strength and uncertainties of the in vivo and the in vitro assays. And the publication also proposed an adverse outcome pathway to assess eye irritation. Notably, this work concluded that many of the in vitro methods that are currently available are equivalent or scientifically superior to testing in the rabbit model. Okay. Going back to the timeline, I'll touch briefly on the testing framework for antimicrobial cleaning products. This testing scheme uses 3 different assays, although in practice and in most recent years, the cytosensor model is not usually submitted. So this framework utilizes the epiocular model using the ET50 cutoff values, where a test substance is shown to reduce tissue viability by 50% to distinguish between category 1, category 3, and category 4 substances. If the test substance is expected to have any oxidizing properties or is even expected to be irritating, the BCOP assay is available to determine categories 1, 2, and 3. And those in vitro cutoff values are noted in the figure. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the Antimicrobials Division has been using this policy to assess pesticides that are on the market today for many years. And the policy was also applicable to other pesticide formulations on a case-by-case basis. Currently, the registration division does receive paired in vitro and in vivo data for pesticide registration applications, but there was a need for additional work to be done. So that leads me to the most recent work that has been accomplished towards assessing eye irritation for agrochemical formulations. And this work was published in 2004 by Anna van der Zalm as the primary author. This paper proposes two defined approaches for classification of agrochemical pesticides across all four hazard categories. If you're not familiar with the EPA categorization scheme, EPA Category 1 indicates severe irritants or corrosive irritants with substances showing minimal irritation classified as Category 4. It's notable that Category 1 and 2 substances do require personal protective equipment, i.e. eye protection on labels, with Category 3 substances may be recommended for eye protection depending on perhaps unique scenarios of that particular product. So this paper and this project was a long-standing collaboration between NICEDM, the PETA Science Consortium, the Institute for In Vitro Sciences, and EPA. And it builds off of the previous policy that was developed in 2015, as well as the study that was published by NICEDM back in 2021. So for this study, 29 agrochemical formulations were donated by companies. And what's notable is that those 29 formulations did span all four EPA toxicity categories based on the traditional in vivo rabbit test available for those mixtures. Okay. So next we're going to jump right into an overview of the two defined approaches proposed in the paper. The first DA can be considered a bottom-up approach, and it's abbreviated with EO for epiocular and BCOP for the bovine corneal opacity and permeability test. This first DA is recommended for formulations that are predicted to be non-irritating. So in this method, we start out with the epiocular model. And if the mean tissue viability in this model is greater than 60%, we can classify the product as Category 4 and stop here. If the epiocular model indicates that the formulation is an irritant, we would need to proceed with the BCOP to distinguish between EPA Category 1, 2, and 3. Now, using the BCOP model, histopathology can be conducted on the cornea to assess the depth of injury. In this defined approach, if the in vitro irritation score in the BCOP model is greater than 55%, after the depth of injury analysis is conducted, that test material would only be able to be classified as EPA Category 1 severe, indicating that the eye irritation damage is irreversible, or EPA Category 2, a moderate irritant, which would also require eye protection. Also, I just wanted to note on the defined approach, the cutoff values for the epiocular and BCOP methods do follow the cutoff values listed in the OECD test guideline 492 and 437 for epiocular and BCOP respectively. Moving to the second DA, only the BCOP assay is utilized, and this is selected if the test material is predicted to be irritating or if there are physical or chemical properties of the substance that would deem it non-compatible with the epiocular model. Again, we are going to use histopathology and depth of injury analysis to distinguish between category 1, 2, and 3. So especially our mild and moderate irritants. In the second DA, I will note that if the in vitro irritation score is less than 3, you can see we can stop and classify at EPA category 4. Also in this DA, it's important to note that if the IIVS value is greater than 15, the depth of injury analysis, of course, would need to be conducted. But if we do have that cutoff value for the IIVS score, then that product would not be eligible for classification as EPA category 3. Okay. This slide summarizes the results of the project. All formulations were coded so that the testing laboratories were blind to the identity of the test substance. The formulation types are also included in the table, as these are the most common mixtures that are registered as agrochemical formulations: emulsifiable concentrates, soluble liquids, and suspension concentrates. So the concordance of the results was compared across all 3 approaches for the 29 formulations. And so that's highlighted in the table. Now, the green highlights indicate a concordance across approaches. The red highlighted sections indicate that the discordance would trigger a change in PPE requirements. And the orange highlighted cells or boxes in the table indicate a discordance that would not trigger a PPE change. So that just kind of orients you on that visual. The specifics, as you can see, for 17 formulations, we did see that all 3 approaches aligned. For 26 formulations, at least 2 of the 3 approaches aligned. And specifically 21 formulations, the defined approaches that were proposed in the paper were aligned or concordant. So I also wanted to highlight just a couple examples here. The misalignment in the 2 defined approaches for formulation Q would trigger a PPE change, as the BCOP model did come back with an EPA classification of category 4 with an IIVS score of less than 3. And lastly, the paper includes a supplemental analysis that breaks down the results for specific formulations in greater detail. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to dive deeper into that section of the paper. I have highlighted formulation K here on this slide, where there was a discordance across all 3 approaches. The epiocular model identified the test material as an irritant with a cell viability of less than 60%. So therefore, using that defined approach, that test material would not be able to be classified as category 4. However, in the BCOP model, based on the depth of injury analysis, the BCOP indicated that there were minimal effects and therefore trigger an EPA category 4 classification. So while the 2 defined approaches do align with regard to the resulting PPE requirements, the historical in vivo data did show adverse effects in one of the 3 animals tested that only cleared by day 14 of the test. So the effects in this animal did drive EPA classification of category 2. Okay. Also, in this paper, the defined approaches were evaluated using a framework for establishing scientific confidence in NAMs. And this framework was published in 2022. The image that you see on the slide is extracted from the paper, and it depicts the components of the framework, the first of which being a fitness for purpose. So in the manuscript, the two defined approaches were reviewed according to the pillars of this framework. So I've just included a few bullet points here that sort of summarizes this weight of evidence evaluation on the DAs. Again, for fitness for purpose, the defined approaches were developed specifically for EPA categorization using internationally accepted test guidelines. Touching again on the human biological relevance, it's notable that the epiocular model uses reconstructed human corneal-like epithelium cells, and that models barrier function as well as epithelial cell death. And the BCOP is a full thickness model, which allows us to assess mechanistic effects and take a look at the depth of injury that is caused by certain substances all the way through the cornea to the endothelium. As these two test methods are accepted OECD test guidelines, they have been assessed for reliability and reproducibility when compared to the in vivo test. And lastly, and then just as importantly, we have data integrity, transparency, and the opportunity for peer review, which really culminates in the published work of these 29 agrochemical formulations. Oops, a little too far. Okay, so to kind of wrap up towards the end of the presentation, I did want to share some of the metrics on alternative test methods that EPA does receive across OCSPP. Both the pesticide program and the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics do track submissions using alternative methods. So we have compiled those numbers for eye irritation tests, skin irritation tests, and dermal sensitization tests. The OPP metrics are currently posted on OPP's website, and the website for OPPT is in development, but those metrics will be posted soon as well. So I'll let you all just have a quick view of the numbers in the table, but you can see that compared to the Toxics Office, the pesticide program does not receive quite as many alternative methods by registrants. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. And it's notable that when we're considering pesticide registration, we have hundreds of applications every year for products. So there really is an opportunity to reduce the reliance on animal testing by implementing these alternative methods for eye irritation. As this work progresses, we hope to see an uptick in submission of alternative methods. And again, I'll just mention again that we do still receive some paired data for in vitro and in vivo test methods for some agrochemical formulations. All right, lastly, I want to cover a few next steps and some things to consider. So the two defined approaches that were presented today are using two OECD test guidelines, but there are other assays available to assess eye irritation. Really relatedly to this work, I did want to briefly highlight another publication that came out this year from Chosky, and the retrospective analysis that was published on 192 formulations that were from CropLife Brazil companies, took a look at 4 different testing schemes to classify those products according to GHS classification. However, it's notable that 70% of the formulations that they took a look at were non-irritating formulations. So this paper presented a bottom-up testing strategy that used 4 methods in total. So we have the BCOP and the epiocular method, as well as the isolated chicken eye test and the GHS concentration threshold approach for classification. So I just wanted to highlight that there are multiple sectors and other work in this space that continue to progress. And that ties into the note that pesticides are registered domestically in the US and globally. So international harmonization in alternative methods is really critical to facilitate their advancement. Here at EPA, we will continue to work through confidence building activities to replace the rabbit test. And this work really is only achievable with the continued collaboration of stakeholders in order to get to a space of full implementation. And lastly, I just want to note that as new NAMS related documents for external stakeholders are published, we will keep sharing that information. And in line with the metrics that were presented a slide earlier, I just wanted to emphasize that we are committed to continuing to track the internal progress that we are making towards implementation of replacement for the rabbit eye test. So with that, I thank you all for your attention to my presentation and look forward to questions later in the program.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that great presentation. We're going to hold all questions to the end of the next presentation, but please add any questions that you have to the Q&A module as they come up. And again, note if they're for a specific speaker. Up next, we have Renee Beardslee. Renee is a human health toxicologist with EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics in the New Chemicals Division, where she is responsible for new chemical human health hazard and risk assessments, as well as scientific projects related to advancing the science in the New Chemicals Division that we use to carry out. I'm also in the New Chemicals Division to carry out our work. Previously, she was with ORD, where she worked on integrated science assessments for the Clean Air Act. She has a PhD in toxicology from North Carolina State University and a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from the University of Michigan. So thank you for being here today, Renee, and please go ahead.
Thank you.
I can see your slides.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Very happy and appreciate the opportunity to be sharing my perspective today, and certainly want to upfront thank the organizers and everyone here for attending the webinar. Also, obligatory EPA disclaimer: the views are my own and do not reflect the views or policies of US EPA. Okay, so as a preview, I will be telling you a little bit about EPA's new chemicals program and the legislation under which we work, the importance of NAMs, the new chemicals program, how new chemicals currently assesses hazard and risk for eye irritation endpoint, and then lastly, a few comments about ongoing and planned efforts in support of advancing the science to develop NAMs-based approaches that may be able to be used for regulatory purposes for all endpoints, including eye irritation. New Chemicals Program serves as a gatekeeper to help manage potential risk to human and environmental health from chemicals new to the marketplace. The Toxic Substances Control Act, which is just long for TSCA, requires all new industrial chemicals entering U.S. commerce, whether by manufacture within or import into the U.S., be reviewed by EPA for safety to human and ecological organism health. TSCA serves as sort of a catch-all for any substance that isn't specifically regulated by other legislation. So pesticides or pharmaceuticals or food additives, for example, are not covered by TSCA. Section 5 governs the hazard and risk assessments as well as the risk management of manufacture and use of these chemicals in commerce. And Section 8 requires EPA maintain and update a list of all new chemicals. So this is how chemicals are identified. If a substance isn't listed on the inventory, then it is a new chemical, and EPA must be notified of the intent to manufacture or possess that substance. The list is very large, currently at around 86,500 chemicals, of which some roughly 42,000 are active. So for each new chemical, complete human health and ecological risk assessments comprising both hazard and risk are developed. Each chemical is evaluated by chemistry and fate assessors to understand the chemical, its synthesis, its chemistry, its physical chemical properties. Predictions are made regarding potential reactivity and degradation and expected behavior and fate in environmental compartments. Then, following those determinations, the remainder of the risk assessment process moves forward concurrently. Exposures to workers, consumers, the general population, and environmental organisms are established, while human health and ecological assessors assess the new chemical and identified analogs for hazard identification. Dose response evaluation is included in the hazard assessment, and points of departure are determined for use and risk calculations. And then lastly, risk is calculated and everything is assembled into final hazard documents. The human health assessment, this covers chemistry information, hazard summaries, the details of all considered data for the chemical substance, as well as all analogs, occupational, consumer, and general exposure values, risk assessments, risk calculations, and risk statements. Then these documents are provided to risk managers for their work. So why am I highlighting, which is what is a pretty standard risk assessment? It's because I want to emphasize that for each of these new chemicals that we receive, we complete a full risk assessment rather than say a short abbreviated hazard identification list, maybe accompanied by a qualitative like low, medium, high risk statement. And this is relevant because our legislation requires us to complete all this work, these full risk assessments and all the risk management work in 30 or 90 days. And then on top of that, the legislation is also silent on data requirements. So while submitters must provide all data in their possession or control related to human health and environmental effects, there's no prescribed set of data that must accompany the submission. And the result is that new chemical notices are often submitted with absolutely no human health data. We often even have PChem data lacking. And then just on top of all of that, new chemicals is also a high production program. So there is like a downward trend early in this chart for reasons that are sort of outside the scope of this talk, but for the past 5 years, our submissions have leveled off at somewhere between 400 to 500 chemical notices per year. So to recap, that's 400 to 500 full risk assessments per year, each required to be completed in a 30 or 90-day window. We're talking about great science fast. So in general, having reliable data and approaches to be able to confidently and quickly identify concern for hazard endpoints, such as eye irritation, is so valuable to our program to protect human health. A little bit about TSCA and new approach methods. TSCA legislation has been around for some time, but it was amended in 2016. In that legislation, the law required that prior to requesting testing using vertebrates, EPA consider reasonably available existing information and encourage and facilitate scientifically valid test methods and strategies that reduce or replace the use of vertebrate animals while providing information of equivalent or better scientific quality and relevance that will support regulatory decisions. So for this reason, NAMs are important for many reasons, but for new chemicals in particular, they are also part of the legislation that governs the work. And I'm happy to report, as Lindsay noted, we have made some progress in this space. Of course, wherever OECD test guidelines or other acceptable NAMs-based methods are available, the program encourages and accepts those data with new chemical submissions. And while it's still a small portion, Lindsay just highlighted those numbers. So 209 eye irritation tests, 240 skin irritation, and 110 for skin sensitization over the past 4 fiscal years. Then importantly, I'll be describing shortly is the eye irritation framework we announced in January of this year. It describes how New Chemicals program is prioritizing consideration of the most human relevant and reproducible data to evaluate hazard for eye irritation and corrosion. We are also developing a similar companion document for skin irritation with a target release sometime, hopefully in early 2025. For skin sensitization, we also have the OCSPP draft document for skin sensitization. New Chemicals is also in the process of working with NICEDM and other stakeholders towards implementation of the SIRA ICE model that allows for skin sensitization risk quantification. And then we have yet another companion framework in development for skin sensitization, also targeting hopefully early 2025 release date. And then while some of those items are newer NAMS efforts and are probably what often comes to mind when NAMS are discussed, New Chemicals has historically been a NAMS-based program. New Chemicals uses extensive read across, structural alerts, and chemical category approaches. And we've used analog searching as well as in silico tools such as Oncologic and OECD Toolbox that include strategies such as structural alerts and QSAR tools. So New Chemicals is very familiar with working in the NAMS space, accepting and evaluating NAMS-based data and working with NAMS approaches or frameworks. And so the availability of specifically NAMS data and frameworks to make hazard determinations confidently and quickly to protect human health are of great value to the program. Okay, switching gears to talk about the main event, which is the eye irritation, corrosion, hazard, and risk assessment in the New Chemicals program, and then all about our new framework. So potential hazard for eye irritation and corrosion is evaluated for each new chemical submission. Corrosion in particular is an irreversible effect and can be severe and potentially life-altering or blinding. So it is an endpoint of high concern for both workers and consumers in our assessments. A hazard finding results in an unquantified risk statement, and risk management applies personal protective equipment to workers. if eye irritation or corrosion hazard is identified for new chemical substance. We certainly clearly want to protect workers from this adverse outcome, but we would also like to not unnecessarily burden them. We all sort of know what it's like to have to wear PPE all day, and it can be a lot. So we want to make protective yet accurate determinations. And then, of course, for consumers, we cannot apply PPE. So our current default approach is to place concentration limits on final formulations. As a regulatory program, though, these decisions must be based on best available science. For eye irritation and corrosion endpoint, we're lucky because there are a number of available OECD test guidelines and other accepted methods to evaluate this endpoint, the majority of which are actually NAMS approaches. So all of these considerations together were the basis for the development of the eye irritation framework. We wanted to develop an approach that would allow new chemicals to make decisions confidently and quickly, using the best available science to protect the health of workers and consumers. So in developing the framework, we identified 4 clear goals that we wanted to achieve. First and foremost, our most important goal was to prioritize the use of best available science for decision-making. This is our guiding principle throughout all of the work that we do here in the program. We also wanted to support EPA's mandate under TSCA to promote NAMS methods and strategies to reduce and replace the use of vertebrate animal models. We also aim to provide clear scientific direction to new chemicals assessors and improve consistency across assessments. And lastly, we wanted to document our approach to provide transparency to stakeholders. After identifying the goals of the framework, we asked ourselves, okay, so how do we achieve these goals? What strategy will we use? I just told you that first and foremost, our most important goal was to prioritize use of best available science for decision-making, and that is our guiding principle throughout all of our work. So it made sense to also make that our primary strategy when actually writing the framework. We also decided to rely on existing peer-reviewed publications and guidance and test guidelines already accepted by federal and international entities to extend that emphasis on best available science, while simultaneously providing flexibility and complying with TSCA statute and OECD agreements. So prioritizing that use of best available science led us to evaluate the state of the science regarding eye irritation and corrosion testing. Lindsay spoke about the human relevance of the NAMS test, but I also want to highlight some published work regarding reproducibility. The historical in vivo rabbit assay was reviewed for its reproducibility in some published manuscripts by evaluating the probability of identifying an identical or different GHS category given the availability of 2 or more rabbit assays available for the same chemical. So this lower table that I have displayed here, it summarizes the results of that study, and it's clear that the reproducibility of the in vivo rabbit assay is in question. So in the 2 center lines, the irritating category 2 chemicals are especially difficult to access, but even a category 1 corrosive chemical was only identified to be corrosive 75% of the time on a repeat test. And for this data set, you can see that 10% of the time, corrosives were identified as not irritating based on a second test, which is really just remarkable. Due to subjectivity and sources of variability, it's not difficult to understand the irreproducibility. And as the NAMS data has been demonstrated to be more reproducible and human relevant, this led us to organize the framework around prioritization of these NAMS data. So assembling all of that together, we were able to make some clear statements. So New Chemicals program prefers the use of methods that use human cells or human tissues known to be sensitive, which carry a high degree of confidence when generating non-irritating predictions. And two, to assess irritation or corrosion, New Chemicals program prefers the use of methods that use human cells or human tissues with the potential to assess the full range of severity and or other reproducible and relevant in chemical, in vitro, or ex vivo methods. Broadly, the framework details a three-step approach. So first, determine data availability and complete a scientific review of data quality and applicability. Then two, prioritize data available based on human relevance and reproducibility. So first, human cell or tissue data, then in vitro and chemical, ex vivo data, and then lastly, evaluate in vivo data. In the absence of any eye irritation data, the allowance for consideration of skin irritation data was made. And then for data gaps or complete absence of data, other information such as pecan properties may be considered. Okay, so complicated decision flow chart here, which I definitely acknowledge is not readable, but I wanted to display it so you all could see. So the framework includes both a written decision tree, but also the flow chart for assessors to follow in assessing cases. I'm not going to detail the individual steps, but it follows those three main steps I just outlined. And I'll note that we maintained a narrow scope for the framework. Our intent was really to develop a framework to prioritize data, and therefore we elected to not address details outside the scope, such as analog selection or decision-making in complete absence of data. So certainly more simple decision trees are available, like those detailed in the OECD 467 defined approach, and I have one of those displayed here. So why didn't we do something more straightforward like this? Well, I previously mentioned that TSCA does not specify data requirements. Therefore, we are often sourcing data from wherever we can find it, which includes a variety of places, including internal EPA CBI data, 8E data, which is data submitted by submitters that they might find in the back of a filing cabinet that has very few details, public databases such as ECHA, or risk assessments from other regulatory entities. And the result is that we are often evaluating complicated and messy data sets. So it was necessary that the framework account for most, if not all, of these complicated data sets to provide direction for assessors. So we settled and arrived at this more detailed flowchart, and I would direct everyone to the framework to see it better, where you can make it larger and see all the individual steps, and then also read the accompanying written out framework, which details each individual step and the outcome of each decision. So I thought that I would provide an example of applying the framework to a real case we had recently. So I've redacted any actual identifying chemical data because it's internal CBI data. So unfortunately, I can't provide structures or names or casts, but this is an example of kind of a typical submission where we received zero data on the new chemical substance, and then we looked to a variety of sources and developed this messy set of data that we had to evaluate. And when I was considering what example to provide, I could have provided something very simple and straightforward, but this is a little bit more complicated. And so I hope that it sort of captures how we're thinking about these messy data sets. And even when we we don't have like really clear direction we're trying to apply the framework to maintain its spirit. So we had, like I indicated, no information on the new chemical substance. We identified a single analog that we felt was good, but not perfect, as it only had we had two sort of moieties of interest. It included one, but not the other. And then it was subject to hydrolysis, but this is a very slow enzymatic hydrolysis. So we don't necessarily expect, if this were to, for instance, new chemical substance to be exposed to the eye, that it would hydrolyze and therefore release the hydrolysis product immediately. But the hydrolysis products did capture some of the moieties of interest that the new chemical substance had. So we felt that we could at least use these data to help inform our decision making. So we actually had data on the hydrolysis product, and then we identified analogs of the hydrolysis product. So to recap, new chemical substance, no data. New chemical substance analog, some data. Hydrolysis product, some data. And then we also looked at analogs of the hydrolysis product. But all the data was sort of incomplete. So looking down the eye irritation side, which is the second column, the analog for the new chemical substance just had an OECD 438 isolated chicken eye. And so the conclusion was inconclusive. All we could determine was that the test was telling us it was irritating or corrosive in some way, but it couldn't determine. So a start. The hydrolysis product also had in vitro data, but it too was inconclusive. The 492 just again said irritating or corrosive. And then we had a head cam test, and the data from echo was so messy and unclear. We couldn't really make a clear conclusion about what the data was saying. It just seemed like it was maybe irritating or severely irritating. The variations in available protocols for this test also made it very difficult to draw any specific conclusions between irritation and corrosion. And then for the hydrolysis product analogs, these two had rabbit tests that were both non-irritating findings. And this third hydrolysis product analog had a complete set of data, a complete set of in vitro data. So the 437 was inconclusive, but the 492 determined that it was not irritating. So this we could call not irritating. So it's not completely clear here. We don't have like a specific conclusion that we can make based on really any individual data. So we sort of evaluated this analog as priority and determined that we were going to call it irritation or corrosion because it did seem there is high possibility for irritation or corrosion. But then looking across the data, we felt that the probability for corrosion was unlikely, determined on the lack of clear corrosive effects and this more mild results, probably not irritating for this analog. So our final, and the skin sensitization you can see is like very similar. So our overall final call for this new chemical substance for eye irritation was that it was irritating. And so I think the really important part of this example is that we did have this hydrolysis product analog data that was not irritating in rabbits, but because we're prioritizing in vitro data, we prioritized that data and still found an irritating call, even though this rabbit data was not irritating. And that's based on the fact that we know the rabbit data is so irreproducible as I described. hopefully that was sort of clear. I can certainly answer questions after. Okay, so if you remember only 3 things from this talk, please remember that New Chemicals program is a high volume program with extremely short timelines. Our unofficial mission statement should be do great science, but make it fast. New Chemicals has demonstrated preference for the most human relevant reproducible data and encourages the use of NAMs where appropriate. And irritation and corrosion is an important endpoint for New Chemicals, and our newly released framework prioritizes the best available science, which is that human relevant reproducible NAMs data for decision making. To conclude, just a few brief comments about ongoing efforts and future plans. We have initiated implementation of the framework. We're planning an iterative process to assess, review, and revise the framework to ensure that it is achieving its goal. And we hope to share lessons learned with stakeholders in the risk assessment community, ideally in a publication at some point. And then Lindsay spoke about future plans for OPP and OPP. Lindsay spoke about future plans for OPP, and OPT's future plans align with those she described. Continuing to build confidence in and promote development and acceptance of NAMs is a priority across our offices for not only eye irritation, but a variety of endpoints. And then in particular, I encourage everyone to watch for the companion skin irritation and skin sensitization frameworks I mentioned that we plan to release in 2025. So again, thank you to everyone in attendance, the organizers, my colleagues at EPA and our collaborators at IVS, Innovative, NICEDM, and PETA Science Consortium. I would love to give special thanks to everyone on this list. Everyone on this slide contributed to this work so much, and it was really a great collaborative effort.
Oh, thank you for coming by. It's been a little crazy.
Yeah, and thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much, Renee. That was really lovely, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from Lindsay as well, so I'm sure our attendees did. We have quite a few questions already, so we'll get started on putting those to our speakers. And again, if you have any questions that occur to you while we're doing the Q&A, feel free to put them in the Q&A module. Again, we can't keep track of them in the chat, so don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, please. And I will also mention that as Amy and I are moderating and giving questions to Lindsay and Renee, if any of the rest of you, Gino, Rachel, and Naladri want to jump in on a question, feel free to do that. Okay, let's get started. So the first one that I see is, it is directed at, it was after Lindsay's presentation, so I'll let her go first, but Renee, you could also answer it as well. So how do you resolve differences between the in vivo results with potentially lower toxicity seen with the in vitro assays? Will the agency allow the lower toxicity category, or will it maintain the higher toxicity category?
This is a really great question, and it definitely I think speaks to some of the underlying issues with orienting the NAMS model directly with the rabbit test. And what we are striving for is to prioritize and have the highest confidence in the in vitro method using more human relevant models, using approaches that are quantitatively assessed, rather than the rabbit test, so that we do have full confidence that a lower toxicity category that is the result of an in vitro model is indeed the correct classification for that particular product. But it's a challenge, and it's a really great question. So thanks for asking it.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Okay, this other question I think is directed towards Lindsay as well. There's been more time for questions to come in for you. So I'm going to paraphrase because there were a lot that were a little bit similar, and many of them revolved around what is the scope? So does this apply to only formulations? Does it apply to active ingredients? Does it apply to conventional agrochemical formulations? What about microbials and so forth?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying, in regards to the scope, is that since the first alternative framework was presented almost 10 years ago, we have considered NAMS data on a case-by-case basis. So the scope really is applicable to mixtures, to single active ingredients, as well as microbial pesticides. Now, the DAs that were presented today were specific to common agrochemical formulations, indicating mixtures. But that's, one, although a broad number of registrations, it is a fairly narrow scope of chemistries. So one thing that I try to do to some of the folks who've placed questions in the Q&A is to encourage people to consult directly with the applicable registering division to talk about the NAMS approaches that you feel are applicable to your product registration prior to submission. I don't want the message from this presentation to be left with, we are only looking at defined approaches just for this one subset of agrochemical formulations, or only looking at defined approaches for a subset of antimicrobial products, specifically consumer cleaning products. So the goal is that the scope will be across the board. But again, that's also tied to what are the unique physical chemical properties of a particular product? Do those properties, are they within the domain of applicability for the test methods that are OECD accepted, or maybe perhaps they're not appropriate? So it's kind of a long, broad answer, but I do hope it sends the message that we want the scope to be broad, and that's what we're working towards.
Renee, I have a question for you, which I just lost because it moved up in the popularity. There it is. They're wondering if NAMS results are potentially reportable under TSCA Section 8E.
Yes, so I'm not an attorney, so interpretation of the statute is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that yes, and that's based on, actually the slides will be available, I believe. So on slide 7, I have quotes from the statute, and it's here, well, this is not quoted, but it says submitters must provide all data in their possession or control related to health or environmental effects. So that is a broad statement. NAM's irritation data, for example, is related to health effects. So my understanding or interpretation of that would be yes, but certainly anyone like submitting to the program will have a risk manager, and those risk managers can actually like detail specifics about the statute or have more understanding of the statute.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and Gino.
See Gino
Can,
coming up.
can I just add to that? And thank you, Renee, and thanks for the question, because I know section 8E is a little different than submitting under 5. But, and Renee's absolutely right. I'm not an attorney either. I don't even want to be one. But I think it is important to note that we have received NAM information under 8E. So I'm guessing that certain companies have made the decision to follow that, but I don't think there's ever been any follow-up or analysis of that. So, but we have received NAM information under section 8E.
Great, that's very helpful. Thanks to both.
Thanks, Gino.
Great. I'll pass back a question to you, Lindsay. It's fairly similar to the last question. I think you've answered it, but it's really what the majority of questions, even still coming in, are centering around, which is this idea of the scope. So that also includes methods that aren't particularly explicitly in the defined approaches that you talked about today. I'm assuming a company could come to the appropriate division and talk about those, and also that there is no need to wait for anything else, any official guidance or policy, some sort of piece of paper to come out from the EPA, OPP, that companies could today talk with the relevant division and submit a NAM.
Yes, absolutely. That option is on the table. And it is our intent and our priority to post a more formal external communication to all stakeholders in order to really detail our position on what test methods, the defined approaches that are available to assess across all 4 EPA hazard categories. We definitely know that is needed. It builds confidence for the stakeholders to submit, as well as other registering bodies and regulating bodies, so that we don't have that now. We do have an open door for consultation for pre-registration meetings. So that's the recommendation that I would give folks on the call today.
Okay. And that's, again, we're talking about NAM data alone. This isn't a situation where you're asking for paired data. This is talking about, where appropriate, a standalone submission of the NAM data.
Exactly. Yep.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for that clarification, because there was a question coming in about whether they misunderstood whether NAM's data alone was accepted. And so I'm glad that got clarified.
Yeah. And I'll just chime in real quick if I can,
Yes,
Christy, just, to touch on the paired data. I think it also links really well to what Renee presented in her case study, as far as what do you do when you have both studies, and how do you prioritize? And so some of the questions that New Chemicals Division went through on their framework similarly are things that OPP needs to work through if we do have submissions that still include paired data. Which method are we going to rely on for classification? So I just wanted to throw that extra thought to tie it in there.
Thank you. Another question for Renee is, first of all, great explanation of your example. And they're wondering if the company would like to contest an irritation finding, what would be the process? Would they discuss with you what type of data would be needed? I guess, for example, if there was sort of unequivocal data or inconclusive data, then they would come to EPA and talk about what testing would help to clear up that inconclusive or other result.
Yes, that's correct. So every submission is assigned a risk manager to help shepherd the submission through the process. And those risk managers are sort of the interface between the risk assessment branches and the submitter. So communication with the risk managers would be the first step. And then risk managers will often definitely reach out to the risk assessors to talk about what information that would be helpful for us to evaluate any endpoint, or to, if we're looking at analog data, for example, rather than new chemical data, like what new chemical data would help sort of give us better information for a specific endpoint evaluation. So we love information. Please provide us data.
Thanks.
So there's a question here that I'm not certain EPA can answer or will answer, but it might be a perfect question for Christy, so I'll throw it out there anyway. I think the question is getting at what labs are out there that can conduct this testing, and that can be used for registration data submission purposes. I'm not sure EPA can endorse any one lab or name drop, but I think Christy would be happy to.
At the risk of being too forward, I would mention that my organization, Institute for In Vitro Sciences, is a GLP in vitro laboratory. And so we conduct the assays that are listed in the approaches that were presented. And if you want to get in touch, we can certainly provide some other suggestions as well.
Yeah, always a great resource, IIVS. We also have a page on our website. If you go to the psci.eu, it's a testing resource page that lists different laboratories involved in this in vitro space. So that's another place you can look for some ideas.
All right, so I have another question. There's sort of a couple of questions spread out about the same topic, which is international harmonization. So this is directed to you, Lindsay, about the OPP framework. And it sort of centers around the idea that different agencies evaluate, whether it's in vivo or in vitro data, evaluate the data differently. So the example here is that PMRA doesn't use, in Canada, Health Canada, PMRA doesn't use the days to clearance in the in vivo test as, like EPA does. And they're wondering if that impacts I guess comparisons to the in vitro data, but more specifically, if there are ways to make sure that the new in vitro approaches and DAs are harmonized with Canadian partners. And so maybe you can say a little bit about that.
Sure. I saw that. That was a great question, and it definitely speaks to the importance of international harmonization. I'll answer that there's definitely more work that needs to be done specifically in that space. We've had some preliminary discussions with PMRA on the eye irritation work to date, but that is something that needs to continue to happen throughout this year, to see what is the best approach to achieve some sort of alignment, not knowing exactly what that may look like, but the discussions definitely need to be happening, as it's critical component to harmonization and acceptance outside of the US.
Lindsay.
And maybe a somewhat related question here, I think getting at why EPA doesn't kind of off the shelf recognize some of the OECD guidance, which I think has to do with some of the differences in categories between GHS and EPA. I don't know if you can speak to that, Lindsay.
Yeah, I would say along those lines that, you know, the 4 category classification for EPA has been somewhat of a barrier in the past. I know that there's definitely an argument that can be made for using some of the approaches that specifically identify corrosives, for instance, across all chemicals. You know, if just a hypothetical, for instance, you have a mixture or an active ingredient that was identified using one of the OECD test guidelines as being a corrosive material. Let's come to EPA and talk about it, perhaps before doing the in vivo rabbit test, because, you know, if we're going to be on that side of the spectrum for classification, is it really necessary to do the animal test? So it's a good question. We'd like to move beyond where we are right now, so that, you know, there can be some acceptance. Just, you know, we'll take OECD 437 or 439 tomorrow, but obviously I can't say that on this webinar, but it's definitely questions that we would encourage registrants to submit to appropriate divisions.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Great, thank you. We have another question about the formulation phys-chem properties and whether that impacts the confidence in applying different assays. So specifically, were there certain formulas, and this is directed to Lindsay, but I think either of you could also speak to it. Were there formulas or mixtures of chemicals where there were more false positives or false negatives? Maybe we'll start with Lindsay and then go to Renee.
So I actually don't have a great answer to this question. As far as the data set that the question is considering, I'm not entirely sure if it's just for the work that was most recently published on the 29 formulations, or if the questioner is asking more broadly about some of the data that we've received in-house prior to the publication.
Yeah, I wonder maybe if a good recommendation would be to take a look at the publication, which might have some more specific information about that.
Yeah, that's really all I have to add on this.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay.
So for new chemicals, it's a little different than for pesticides because we evaluate new chemical substances and that's it. We don't evaluate formulations. We don't ever, our testing data is on the new chemical if we get data at all. And so this is a question that we do think about, and we have actually been thinking about more recently. It is rather complicated because in some situations or many situations for us, a submitter may not even have any idea about a final formulation because they're just like perhaps manufacturing a new chemical substance, and then they may foresee that it will go into like a laundry detergent or a soap or some sort of cleaner, but what that could be, what that final formulation looks like, they're not even manufacturing it yet. So they don't even know, let alone us having any idea. So it is a tricky question for us, and which I sort of reference this a little bit, our current approach, default approach, is to limit an irritant or corrosive to concentrations of final formulations based on like sort of GHS guidelines or broad statements. But it is actually something we are thinking about and seeing if we can come up with something for some of these tricky situations to have a more expansive approach.
Great. Thanks, Renee.
Great. And we're almost out of time, but I'm going to try to sneak one last question in here that can be for both of you, and it's fairly broad, of pulling from a couple questions that were submitted. What is the EPA planning to do to ensure consistency across divisions and to encourage NAMS submissions? And this webinar is probably part of the answer to that question.
Yeah, Amy, absolutely. I'll just briefly mention, we try our very best to keep our OPP NAMS page up to date. With competing priorities, that can be a little bit of a challenge. However, as far as promoting the alternative acceptance of the alternative methods, I'll just reiterate what I said previously, is that it is our goal and priority to release external communication sooner rather than later, so that type of notice to registrants would be applicable across all divisions. Also, if the questioner is not familiar with the OPP metric, the OPP NAMS page, we do have a specific committee that is formed that does evaluate unique submissions for the acute tox 6-pack. And so that's always an avenue that promotes consistency across the division. So more information is about that committee and about our work is on our website.
Yeah, that's great. And I just put a link to that website in the chat, and it has the 3 great kind of sublinks within to the metrics, and then strategies to reduce, strategies to replace. That's a great source of information. Thanks.
And so for new chemicals, of course, we work under a different statute than pesticides, and we are fortunate that we are the only new chemicals division. But our approach is very broad. As I mentioned, the TSCA statute does not have specific data requirements, and we have a included directive addressing NAMS. So our approach is always to encourage submitters to reach out to us if they have something different or a unique situation. Reach out to us early, and we are happy and willing to work with submitters on any NAMS proposal that they have.
That's maybe the best take-home message I think we could have. Well, thank you both for presenting here with us today, for taking the time out to prepare and talk with us about this. Thank you all for attending and for all your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we have them, and we'll try to see if we can get answers to most of them out to you. As was mentioned earlier, the slides and the recordings will be posted on the Pesticides Consortium website in a couple of days. And also you can register right now for the August webinar, which will be focused on computational methods for acute toxicity. Thanks again, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful summer and see you soon.
Thank you.